Siege warfare in ages gone by was a grisly thing. Today, urban warfare consists of aerial bombing, aerial shelling and street-to-street fighting. For most of recorded history, it has involved sieges. Human beings figured out pretty early on in their societal development that the best way to defend themselves from marauding attackers was to build walls around their settlements. Others then realised that in order to get at whatever resources that settlement had, they needed to break through the walls or otherwise defeat the people within. Hence was born the concept of the siege. One of the most straightforward methods of winning one was to simply starve the defenders into submission. If they were cut off from fresh food supplies, even the most stoutly defended city or fortification could only hold out for so long. There are no shortages of tales of the besieged turning to extreme methods in such instances. Late in 1870, for instance, the denizens of Paris began eating the residents of Paris's zoo as their city was besieged by the Prussians during the Franco-Prussian War. However, sometimes even more grisly events ensue. From amongst such sieges, the Siege of Suiyang in China in the year 757 stands out in this way. For you see, at Suiyang that year, the garrison apparently consumed half the city's inhabitants. The question is, can we believe what the sources tell us? Before examining the circumstances in which the Siege of Suiyang took place and what happened during it, it is worth looking at the wider circumstances in which this occurred. The Siege of Suiyang took place during the Tang era of Chinese history. China's history, down to as recently as 1911, just over a century ago, was divided up into eras depending on the imperial dynasty which ruled the country at a given time. Hence, the era which came to an end in 1911 was known as the Qing Dynasty, or Qing era, as the Qing Dynasty ruled China between 1644 and 1911. The Tang Dynasty rose to power in the year 618 and ruled China down to 907, a period of nearly 300 years. The rulers were actually the Li family, who hailed from Shanxi in central China, but the founder of the dynasty, Li Yuan, was the Lord of Tang, and so this aristocratic title was applied to the dynasty. At the time he rose to power, China was already an advanced civilization. It had a centralized bureaucracy and effective state apparatus which were far more developed than, for instance, the Kingdom of Mercia in England at the time or the Merovingian Kingdom of France. Significantly, its advanced bureaucracy and state systems meant that large armies could be raised through tax collection. There were also many large cities across China, much larger than the rural landscape much of Europe had descended into after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Tang China's capital, Xi'an, or Chang'an as it was then known, had, for instance, a population of 1 million people and was the largest city in the world. The city of Suiyang was an important regional city in the centre of the Chinese state, one with perhaps a population of 60,000 people. It is equivalent to modern-day Sangchu, about halfway between Beijing and Shanghai, on a north-south axis and considerably inland towards central China, though still in the eastern side of the country. The Siege of Suiyang came about because of a wider war within China. This is known as the An Lushan Rebellion. It was launched by An Lushan late in December 755. This An Lushan was a Sogdian or Goturk military commander. In millennia gone by, the Chinese state was concentrated in what is now eastern and central China. The west and much of the north of the country were controlled by other groups, like the Tibetans, the Mongols, and various Turkish groups. The latter had moved into the east of China during the Great Turkic migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries CE. Many had subsequently obtained positions as military commanders and leaders of mercenary units in the employ of the Tang government of China. An Lushan was amongst these. However, in December 755, An Lushan decided to revolt against his former employers and try to seize control of the Chinese state. He was motivated to do so as the Tang Dynasty was particularly weak at that time, facing a wide range of pressures on its eastern and northern borders from the Tibetan Empire and groups like the Balhae and Khitan in Manchuria. An Lushan revolted in the east of the Tang state. The Siege of Suiyang commenced just over a year into the war. The irony is that, although the war is known as the An Lushan Rebellion, just 4 days after the Siege of Suiyang commenced, An Lushan was killed far away in Luoyang by his own son, An Qingshu, who usurped his power. Suiyang was drawn into the An Lushan Rebellion from early on. It's not far to the east of the Tang Dynasty capital, Chang'an, and is even closer still to Luoyang, where An Lushan had made his capital. It also occupies a strategic route further east from those 2 cities to the coastal regions of the Yellow Sea. It controlled the passages of the Grand Canal through here, a vast man-made canal which was central to Chinese commerce in this era. Thus, late in 756, An Lushan had instructed 2 of his generals, Yin Ziyi and Yang Chaozhan, to take a large army eastwards and seize Suiyang. They arrived there and laid siege to the city and its Tang Dynasty defenders in January 757. The siege is said to have officially begun on the 25th of January. Some accounts suggest that An Lushan's army, which of course became An Qingshu's army not long after the siege began, consisted of as many as 150,000 men, while the defenders were no more than 10,000. The defenders were led by Zhang Xuan, a Tang general who was widely praised by subsequent generations for his loyalty to the Tang Dynasty and his role in suppressing the An Lushan Rebellion. These numbers of men involved on both sides are plausible, though not entirely likely. Ancient histories, be they written in ancient Greece and Rome or on the other side of Eurasia in China, tended to have a fairly flexible relationship with the truth when it came to the size of armies, often exaggerating for effect. It seems likely in this case that the army of the besiegers was smaller than reported. We will call these the Yan army henceforth, as An Lushan had proclaimed himself as ruling over a Yan dynasty before his death, and his son succeeded to this. All of this raises the question of what the written sources for the siege actually are. There are a number of quite detailed sources for the history of Tang-era China that all shed light on the Siege of Suiyang. It is a particularly well-documented event, a fact owing to the controversial elements of it. One major account is found in the Old Book of Tang. This is an enormous 200-volume history of the Tang Dynasty and its 3 centuries-long rule over China, one which was compiled over a period of about 100 years, between 941 and 1044, after the succeeding Jin dynasty claimed power. A similar source for the siege is the New Book of Tang. This is a revised version of the Old Book of Tang, which was compiled between 1044 and 1060, and offered new information and a different format to the Old Book. The Ziji Tongjian, a title which transliterates as a comprehensive mirror in aid of governance, was written by a Chinese scholar named Sima Guang in the 1070s and early 1080s, and provided a very lengthy history of China from 403 BCE down to 959 CE. It also provides information on the An Lushan Rebellion and the Siege of Suiyang. Finally, there were numerous other sources, such as a handful of histories written on the life of Zhang Yun, the Tang general in charge of the defense of Suiyang. These numerous sources present a clear idea of how the Siege of Suiyang played out. In the early months of the siege, it was more like a series of military engagements which were occurring in and around the city. Yin Ziyi and Yang Chaosung led their forces to the city on several occasions in early 757 and tried to assault it. Each effort was repulsed by the Tang armies led by Zhang Xuan. It was only in the summer of 757 that a more sustained investment of the city began. The Yan generals had realised that they could not take the city by a short, sharp assault, and so they would have to starve Zhang Xuan and his men into surrendering, or literally starve them to death inside the city if they refused to surrender. Thus, while the military engagements in and around Suiyang lasted for 10 months between late January and late November 757, the actual full siege of the city, when no one could get in or out, went on for just 122 days, or 4 months, between late July and late November 757. Sieges like this are often a waiting game. Forays were made against the city walls. There's an element of psychological warfare in this. If you launch unexpected attacks against the walls, and do so in ways which lack a pattern, then the defenders have to always remain vigilant, always waiting to be attacked. In addition to going hungry, they are now becoming psychologically exhausted as the weeks go by, and they have to always be prepared for the next attack. It was in this context of hunger and psychological stress that the Tang defenders of Suiyang apparently began engaging in systematic acts of cannibalism. The reasons why they might have done so are obvious. They had run out of food. Grain supplies had already been low at Suiyang when the siege began. This was over a year and a half into the An Lushan Rebellion, and was during a period when China and the Far East in general were experiencing instability and crisis. Agriculture is interrupted in such circumstances, and it is unsurprising that the grain silos of Suiyang were not exactly overflowing in 757. A sign of how desperate the situation could become was seen in the first weeks of the siege in August 757, when the city authorities began issuing tree bark and tea leaves as a way of supplementing grain rations. Before long, cannibalism was being resorted to. Perhaps this was not as out of the ordinary as it seems. Systematic cannibalism during military emergencies seems to have occurred on many occasions in ancient China. Legend has it that a particularly ruthless warlord of the early 7th century by the name of Chu Tsan, who had dominated large territories on the Han River at that time, made cannibalism a staple of his army's logistics, forcing communities to hand over victims that fed his army. The story sounds a little too macabre to be true, and that raises a question about the Siege of Suiyang. Did what we hear about in the old Book of Tang and other sources actually happen? If cannibalism was engaged in, what is the likelihood it was engaged in to the enormous extent that the ancient sources make out? The reality is that it was almost certainly exaggerated. This was hardly a long siege. The sustained siege, the period of time in which the city could not be resupplied in any fashion, went on for just 4 months. A long time to be sure, but not enough to warrant the kind of systematic cannibalism that some accounts of the siege would have us believe occurred. Any account of the Siege of Suiyang has to bear in mind that the Chinese historians who subsequently related the details of it were drawing on a tradition which quite possibly exaggerated what occurred in order to create a shocking story. The impression that the cannibalism that occurred at Suiyang was exaggerated is strengthened when we look at the accounts provided in the old Chinese sources. These suggest that Zhang Xuan ordered that this be done systematically. First, the women of the city were killed and eaten, and then the elderly and children. While the claim that non-combatants were cannibalized first makes a sort of horrific logic, the numbers suggested do not stack up. It is stated in the sources that tens of thousands of people, perhaps as much as half of the civilian population of this city of Suiyang, were cannibalized in this fashion. This seems fairly unlikely. The siege lasted 122 days, and the city did have existing food supplies when it began. take into account the fact that people would have been morally disinclined to resort to cannibalism except in the most extreme circumstances, and it is evident that the figures do not make sense. Cannibalism was probably resorted to at the Siege of Suiyang, yet it was almost just as certainly not engaged in on the extreme levels suggested in the Chinese sources. The Siege of Suiyang came to an end in late November 757. Evidently, the assaults on the walls and the deaths of the defenders had reduced their numbers sufficiently that they could not maintain as strong a defence as they had been able to early on in the clash. By November, the Yan forces were launching nearly continuous assaults on the walls to wear the defenders down completely. Finally, on the 9th day of the 19th lunar month of Chi Te, what was the 24th of November 757, the walls were breached and the Yan forces flooded into the city. Maybe they were appalled to learn what had happened there. Maybe they would have known to expect something like this. They were equally brutal in their actions. Many of the inhabitants were killed, while Zhang Xuan was executed. The Yan general, Yin Ziyi, had wished to spare his life, believing him to have been a formidable adversary, but he was ordered to put him to death. The histories of his life, written by subsequent generations, were conflicted. On the one hand, they praised him for his steadfast loyalty to the Tang Dynasty and the extreme measures he had resorted to in order to try and stop Suiyang from falling to the enemy. On the other hand, those methods were extreme. They could only be glossed over by historians by stating that he had resorted to them out of desperation. Just days after the siege ended with the fall of the city to the Yan forces, a Tang army arrived to the region to try and break the siege. They were too late. Still, the Tang would ultimately emerge victorious in the wider war. Less than 2 years later, An Lushan was overthrown as the Yan leader and killed by one of his own generals, Shi Serming. He was in turn overthrown by another former ally, Shi Chao, in 761. This, the fourth ruler of the Yan dynasty in as many years, was the last leader of the An Lushan Rebellion. 2 years later, in 763, he was defeated by a Tang army which had obtained aid from the Turkic Uyghur Khaganate to the west. Shi Chao took his own life and the Tang dynasty began reasserting control over all of China, Suiyang included. The outcome of the siege thus proved ephemeral, but the memory of it and the alleged mass cannibalism that took place during it lived on and was recorded in many sources over the centuries that followed.